It seems to me that the way forward into a new humanity, the possibility is right on the edge there. Because when you look at the universe over its long transformation, the universe always moves towards greater wholeness.
Sister Gail Worcelo co-founded the Green Mountain Monastery in 1999, encouraged and supported by her friend and mentor, the late Thomas Berry. Berry, a cultural historian and Passionist priest, was a groundbreaking thinker who contemplated the new story science has told us of the 13.8 billion year history of our evolving universe. He considered the implications of this new story for our religion, education, economy, and government. I'm your host, Kyle Kramer, and I connected with Sister Gail to learn more about how she and her community are living out Thomas Berry's vision amidst the many challenges of our current moment. Sister Gail, it is wonderful to talk with you again. We've had our paths cross in various ways over the years, and I have very much been looking forward to this conversation.
Yes, thank you, Kyle. So happy to be here and great to connect with you again.
Yes, the pandemic is forcing all kinds of new creative ways to connect, and we're really glad that you would take this time. So I want to dive in, if we could, Sister Gail, with someone who is dear to your heart, dear to my heart as well, and someone around whom the Earth and Spirit Center has constructed its work and its mission, Thomas Berry. For those of our listeners who don't know Thomas Berry, I'm wondering if you might give us the quick thumbnail sketch of who this person was, how you knew him, what kind of relationship unfolded there over the years that you and he worked together, and invite our listeners into the man that was Thomas Berry.
Yeah, well, Thomas Berry was a Catholic priest of the Passionist order, which is linked to your center, since your director is also a Passionist priest. And he was also a cultural historian and a self-acclaimed geologian, or student of the earth. And when Thomas Berry exhausted his studies of world cultures and religions, he branched out into the universe and began to study the history of the universe and earth history, and then our role in that particular great story. So that was Thomas Berry's wonderful contribution, particularly in my own life and the lives of many others. I met Thomas Berry in 1983 when I was a novice with the Passionist congregation. And this is a congregation of men and women, sisters, brothers, and priests. So I was with the women, and we had a joint novitiate where speakers and scholars were invited to give classes to us. And one of those presenters and scholars at the time was Thomas Berry. And so I met him in that year, and during the time of our classes with him, he told us the universe story and our role in that story. And he began with that famous line of his, which is in his seminal paper called The New Story, and that's located in the book, The Dream of the Earth. But I remember him beginning with that famous line that goes, we're in trouble right now because we don't have a good story. We're in between stories, and meaning we're in between an understanding of the way things came to be. And so his advocacy was to learn the new story, which is the scientific account of our universe and earth and our role in that story. So that was his predominant gift to us at the time. And I always think of this slide, maybe you have seen it, there's a slide out, a photograph of a cosmos, and then there's a line that says, "You are here." You know, those,
yeah.
So I always think of that as that novitiate experience, like that arrow pointing to a small dot, a planet Earth in the Milky Way galaxy, one galaxy among hundreds of billions of galaxies. And that's what Thomas Berry essentially gave us, our location and our place in the story of the universe.
Right. I remember reading once from Thomas Berry, he mentioned that our religion, our spirituality has to be located within the largest possible context of its time. And I think what's utterly unique about the times we live in now is that we have discovered this vast context, this much larger context for the frame of human existence. And I love that arrow pointing to this small space within a vast universe that we are here. Mm-hmm. And I love also how you and Thomas use the language of story, because I'm of the conviction, I'm not sure where you come down on this, I bet I know, but I don't think that logic and analysis and facts and figures, even when they point to doom and destruction, are necessarily what will move us to new forms of action and engagement. I feel that it's story. And I'm wondering if we could agree on that premise and maybe work from there.
Yes, absolutely, Kyle. I agree. And I think the story touches us at multi-dimensions. So we can be touched and moved through the intellect, through the emotions, through the feelings, through the deep soul. Stories have that capacity to engage us at all of our levels. And through that, then, we move in the world differently.
Right. And as you said earlier, and I completely agree with you, we're in the space between stories on some level. We're stuck, in some ways at least, with an old story that's not serving us well. And I guess I would call that the story of progress, the story of ascension, the story of separation from each other and from the rest of the natural world. And yet there's this new story that's perhaps also an ancient story in some ways, definitely with new insights from the scientific world. What are the contours of this new story? How would you describe that in short form for someone who's not familiar with what this new story is and what it invites us into?
Yeah, well, I'd like to just mention a word that's related that Thomas Berry coined, which is called Ecozoic. Mm-hmm. So it's part of the story of the universe, but it's a focus on the part that is our Earth story. So Thomas Berry coined the word Ecozoic. So eco can be translated as house, the ecos, mm-hmm. Oikos, house, and zoa is life. So we translate Ecozoic as house of life. So the Earth has had various moments, various historical developments in its history. So we could say early Earth was the Paleozoic, and the Middle Earth's history was Mesozoic, and the last 65 million years of Earth unfolding is called the Cenozoic. So Thomas is referring to this new emergence in the story of the universe where humans have a total and incredible comprehensive influence on the history of the planet's unfolding. And he says that Earth is now at a point of either going into the Ecozoic as a house of life or the Technozoic. And he's not referring to a critique of the technology per se, but he's referring to going forward in separation consciousness, going forward in the continual plundering of the Earth community. So he's gearing us within the context of the universe story to go in the direction of the Ecozoic, or creating Earth or understanding Earth and our role here as a house of life. And then he has principles to understand that. And I believe those principles are answering a part of an answer to your question, like, well, what does this universe story teach us?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would love to drill down into that with you as we move forward. But before we do, I think what I'd like to do is quote you back to yourself and maybe have you unpack something which is germane here. You've said that most of us think of evolution as something happening out there in the cosmos, but this process is also happening in and between us as the expressions of relationality, unity, wholeness, and love. Creative unions have been forged throughout the entire evolutionary journey. In our time and at this level of universe complexity, we, meaning human beings, we are the new creative union, forging a higher we with unprecedented potential for a new order of human relatedness. And when I read that, Sister Gail, I'm inspired, and I also feel a bit of trepidation because you're asking a lot. You and Thomas Berry are asking a lot of human beings to be this new force for creative union. It puts us at a really exalted place in the evolutionary journey. And I want to be there with you, and yet at the same time, I'm aware of how profoundly destructive we've been as a species, and how, I think to use Thomas's words, autistic we've become vis-a-vis the rest of the natural world, and bringing along with that this very real possibility of our own self-destruction. So I'm wondering if you might say a few more words about the role of human beings in this unfolding evolutionary story, and the great potential we have to bring about the Ecozoic, and the great risk we face of maybe going the Technozoic route and just living in a degraded future, or maybe not having a future as a species at all, not to put too fine a point on it.
Oh, yeah. The term creative union was, I believe, coined by Teilhard de Chardin, who was a French Jesuit paleontologist and priest.
And
who,
I think a guide star both for you and for Thomas,
yes,
right?
Yes, right. And Teilhard, in studying the story, looking at the story of the universe, saw that the universe proceeds through a series of creative unions. So when two things come together, two different things come together and engage with each other, and of course, something of one has to be let go of, something of the other. They've got to let go of something in order to come together and merge. So, for example, hydrogen and oxygen, these are two elements that came together in a creative union, and that union brought forth water. And then water has had a whole life, in the history and journey of Earth, and has moved through a series of complexities, ending up now in our bodies with the capacity to carry sentiment in the form of a tear. So that all started from this union or creative union of oxygen and hydrogen. And the universe is geared that way. So this brings up a really important fundamental aspect of the universe, and that is this. When we asked Thomas Berry early on, where is the universe going? He answered us and said the universe is going in three directions simultaneously. In all times and in all places, the universe is moving towards greater differentiation, deeper interiority, and more profound communion or relationship. And this is the basis for creative union. It's a fundamental law of the universe that this is how this universe proceeds. It proceeds when difference or differentiated interiorities or subjectivities come together in communion. And that is just how it is in this particular universe. This is how it works.
Yeah, when I've taught Thomas Berry, I've used those three terms as kind of his ground rules for how the universe works.
Yeah.
And they sound highfalutin, but they are, when you really drill down into them, they get it.
They do. And what I like to think about is that these are fundamental principles of the universe itself and life on Earth. So it's not something that any group mandates or the laws of some particular culture or legal system or anything like that. These come with existence. These originate at the beginning, and then they explicate themselves throughout time. And it's been a long 13.7 billion year journey of these principles that are tried and true in our universe.
Would you say
to meet us?
Would you say they're akin to, say, the laws of gravity, of strong and weak attraction, and so forth?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
I know that Thomas has written that the universe is a communion of subjects, not a collection of objects. And we've used that on our own website as a way to really encapsulate these principles for him. What does it mean to say that the universe is a communion of subjects and not a collection of objects?
Yes, I'm so glad you're asking this question because that's central to our exploration of what is subjectivity. So when Thomas is speaking about subjectivity, we have to go back to those fundamental principles. So when he's speaking about the subject, he's saying that every being in the universe is created to be different, right? So we go back to the principle. So difference is the truth. And every differentiated being has its own isness or subjectivity. So subjectivity is a little bit difficult to articulate, but you have to think of the interior of a being. So the ocean's subjectivity is its ocean-ness, or the orangutan subjectivity, it's orangutan-ness, It's the isness. So every being in the universe is differentiated and has a deep interior that reflects its fundamental essence, really. And all of these are held in communion. And we could see in our own time why we're in so much trouble, because in almost everywhere we look, we're experiencing the violation of the subject.
Yes.
The violation of the subject, whether it's human, animal, ocean, mountaintop, subjectivity is being violated.
And I would actually say the other two principles as well, like with differentiation, a monocrop cornfield violates the principle that the universe loves diversity.
Exactly.
Us being cooped up in the pandemic world violates the principle that we're really made to belong to each other.
Yes, great, Kyle. Yes, any monoculture of any kind is not the healthiest, like a nursing home, a place where there's only elderly people, or, anything in which there's just a mono entity, because in the universe, the greater the diversity, the healthier the system.
And yet what's so interesting, not to, again, put too fine a point on it, but we are living within an industrial/post-industrial system that is really built on the creation of uniformity, because that's what makes factories run. That's what makes mass production possible. And the opposite might grind our current economic system to a halt, but it does lead one to ask the question about what can the Ecozoic future look like if our current future is really, at least in the economic sense, predicated on the violation of some of these core universal principles.
Right. Yeah, well, the current system isn't doing too well, is it?
Well, yes and no. It's doing really well at what it was designed to do, which was to make a bunch of uniform parts and pieces. But there, as you and I both know, I think it's got a lot of side effects that really aren't necessarily good for us as a species, for other species, or for the planet.
Yes, that's what I mean, exactly.
I hope we can return to this idea of the Ecozoic and what kind of vision Thomas had for that, and you have for it too in your work. Before we move on to that, though, I'd like to ask you a question about time. We've talked about the story of the universe being an evolutionary story, and to bring Teilhard de Chardin back into this conversation, one of my favorite quotes from him is that we have to trust in the slow work of God. I was talking a couple weeks ago with a paleontologist and geologist, Dr. Kate Belinsky, and we had a wonderful conversation about her deep time perspective on her own work as a scholar and researcher, and then obviously how she thought about society in terms of these long geologic timescales. So I'm wondering, how do you think and pray about this need to balance all of these urgent and pressing needs? We've got ecological damage happening at breakneck speed and with narrow windows for remediation, all the urgent needs around social justice issues, and so forth. How do you balance those things with this deep time, long-term, evolutionary scale of the universe story?
Yeah, well, the first thing is that, and this is going back to Thomas Berry, so this is conceptual response first. To say that Thomas would say that the universe is creative in its larger arc, so that in a space of time called a lifetime, which is very short in terms of the arc of history, in the universe story and Earth story, our 4.5 billion year story, the arc of time of a lifetime is very short. So that we can have a certain confidence in the universe that has already gone through 13.8 billion years of unfolding successfully, even though it has met up with major crises in its evolution. So the large-scale dynamics gives me hope in terms of a big picture context and trusting the process of a universe that, at least up until this time, has known what to do. And then maybe secondly, so that it doesn't feel so overwhelming to myself and even to the listeners, there is something about starting with our first earth, which is our bodies, ourselves. We are made of the primal dust of the planet, of the stars. We can make decisions for immediately in terms of this earth and in relationship to the totality of the planet. So maybe open up your cabinet under the sink and see what you have under there. What are you washing your dishes with or cleaning your house with? Are those chemicals going into the water system? Maybe look at your plate, your dinner plate. Where did that vegetable medley come from? How are you supporting practices in farming that feed you and your family that are in line with planetary systems of health and well-being? On and on. We can start from an immediate place. Also, what about our capacity to experience the natural world, to move you mentioned autism before, to move beyond a certain closed-in space, and even in terms of communicating just with humans, we can open ourselves up to a relationship of encounter with the total community of life, the trees, the plants. So that really has its effects. It may be more invisible or quiet, but it's still effective. It's touching the whole.
Yes, and I love how you label our own bodies as, what did you call it, the first earth or the small earth?
Our first earth.
Our first earth.
First earth.
I'm absolutely with you that we begin with our first earth of the sphere of influence most immediate to us, our own bodies, our own personal choices. I do have a question that has come up in conversations I've had recently around, I guess if I boil it down, it would really be around a theory of change, which is, on the one hand, none of us, or few of us, can repair the whole world, probably none of us. And so we are left to the realms of individual choices that we can more or less control. And there's, I guess, one theory of change that talks about how all of those choices accumulate into a movement, into finally affecting the larger scale change that we'd like to see. And I don't necessarily doubt that paradigm, but I'm beginning to wonder whether it's sufficient. And this is where we probably will veer off the rails in this conversation. But I guess I would like to ask you, as I'm asking a lot of wise people in my life these days, if the change that we hope for when we do our individual actions is not just the hope that enough drops will accumulate in the bucket to fill the bucket, but that maybe something more mysterious than just the accumulation of individual actions is going on, that maybe there's some way in which the universe responds to these seemingly small scale, seemingly insignificant on their own kinds of actions and intentions that does have far broader effects than we can figure out in terms of obvious causality.
Yeah. So Kyle, as you're speaking, I always go back to some sense of we are the universe. So we're not separate from it.
Mm-hmm.
And the powers of the universe that exist are the powers that are operative at all times and in all places, including our own lives. So regarding, you're asking the question about change and the accumulation of change, that I'm thinking in terms of large scale and those powers of the universe. So first of all, one of the powers of the universe is cataclysm. Mm. And over time, over long sweeps of time, the universe does away with that which no longer serves. So when we come to points in time in which we're inside of structures that are no longer viable or functioning for the moment, they may have worked at some point, but they're no longer necessary, or they're not viable, or they're violating the principles of differentiation, interiority, and communion, the universe gets rid of it. It's called cataclysm. The universe also has the capacity to hold on to its achievements. So those achievements that do work and that function and hold things together over time, the universe keeps those, and that's the power of homeostasis. There's other powers, but you get what I'm saying.
Yeah.
We're participants.
Although it makes me worried as to whether the human species will be kept or not. Do we serve the broader purpose? And I think you and Thomas have a positive answer to that, but it still feels like an open question to me. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if we could turn now, Sister Gail, to Green Mountain Monastery, which is your home in northern Vermont. And you had mentioned earlier being a Passionist nun in your earlier days. And you've explained in other places that the history of Catholic women's religious orders were that they were often founded in response to the needs of a particular time. So when the educational system wasn't serving all, nuns founded schools. When the healthcare system was broken or underdeveloped, nuns founded hospitals and healthcare systems and so forth. And I know that you have founded Green Mountain Monastery in response to the needs of our time, which at this point certainly include the human, but go beyond the human. And I'm wondering if you might say a few words about how and when the Green Mountain Monastery was founded and what its mission in this world is.
Yes, so as I mentioned earlier, I began to study with Thomas Berry in 1983 during that novitiate session, and then continued on with him until his death in 2009. But in 1994, he wrote a paper entitled Women Religious, Their Future Role. It's also under the name Women Religious, the Voice of Earth. And in that paper, as you just said, he looked at the historical context of the founding of religious communities. And he said that communities have been founded throughout the ages to meet the needs of the human, as in social work, teaching, etc. But no community has yet to be founded that would address the needs of the planet and its life systems. And so together with him, we decided that we would begin that first community. And so we actually launched out in 1999 to begin the founding of what's now called Green Mountain Monastery and the Thomas Berry Sanctuary, and our general name is Sisters of the Earth Community.
Mm-hmm. I believe your mission statement itself is very simple. Your mission is a single sacred community, which is, I believe, drawn from some language from Thomas Berry. And I guess, how does community and communion factor into this mission? What does it mean to be a single sacred community? What does it mean on the cosmic level, all the way down to the daily logistical level of your monastic life?
Yes, a single sacred community is the first principle of the Ecozoic era, that human and earth form a single sacred community. And we must go into the future as a single sacred community, or we'll perish on the way. And that was Thomas's first principle. And so it will probably take a lifetime to really understand what it means to be a single sacred community, to go into the future with the natural world together in a mutually enhancing way. So we try to do that here in a multiplicity of ways. For example, the way we get our energy, and we do have solar panels, so the sun fuels our electricity, and we grow our food organically and biodynamically. So we're using principles that nourish and sustain, and we're working with the planet, our land that way, and serving guests and ourselves life-giving, nourishing food. So that's coming to an understanding of soil as a community of life that we need to learn how to work with. Our building design, we're also experimenting with structures that are like straw bale, for example, renewable structures that use renewable resources in working with the land and the local bioregion. So we're trying to implement a practical vision of a single sacred community in our daily ways of being here.
I want to stay here with you, Sister Gail, particularly around the questions of community, because everything that you just enumerated makes my heart sing. I'm a former organic farmer and homesteader, and have done similar kinds of practical work in the world, and at the same time realized in the doing of that, as important as it was, that it was all for naught if there wasn't some degree of communal support around it. The Daniel Boone, rugged, independent kind of existence, no matter how perfect in its moral uprightness and consistent application of principles and so forth, that it could just end up being a really lonely and therefore miserable and inconsequential life. I guess to draw the frame back a bit to the earlier part of our conversation where we talked about this current reigning myth of progress and this fundamental separateness between us, to this new, and I guess as Charles Eisenside would put it, a new and ancient story of reunion, of interbeing. What does it look like, first of all, for you and your fellow community members to reweave these broken strands of community, to really craft a life together as a joint venture? And then if we could scale from there, what does it look like to begin that reweaving process at the societal level, at the cultural level? How do we transition to this new story in terms of how we attend to our communal life on all scales?
Yeah, well, I think maybe the first thing for us is to extend the notion of community, so that the community isn't just, as Thomas Berry would say, the human community, apart from the total community of life, is an abstraction. You can't have a human community apart from the whole. Mm-hmm. So that's how we're forming and shaping. So, for example, when we think of our Green Mountain Monastery or our community here, we don't think of just the humans. We don't even think of the building, but we think of ourselves in relationship to the natural world, and then the neighbors, and then the town, and then stretching out to the state, to the country, and then beyond that internationally, and linking, networking. So the notion of community is a big perspective, and also not only internationally but galactically and cosmically. That we're always connected to that we stay connected to the story, and we keep going back to that, and then coming back to this moment, and reflecting back and back in again. So weaving all of that together to create that which may be possible. Mm-hmm.
But I assume in the thick of that, you're also just plain doing the dishes together and hoeing the beans together, and
oh yes,
doing the daily round of beautiful domesticity that's part of community life too.
Yes, you're making me laugh, Kyle, because one of the long-standing jokes we have here is because we're rooted in the monastic tradition, we take a cue from Saint Benedict, who spoke about ora et labora, part of the rule of the Benedictine tradition. It's pray and work, and we like to say that our motto has been ora et labora et labora et labora.
Sounds like life on a farm. Yeah, well, but on the other hand, having spent all those years on a farm, I completely sympathize with that. And on the other hand, I recognize two things. One, that many hands make lighter work, and that work is less laborious when it's done with others, an intentional spirit of communion with this broader perspective that you bring to it. And I guess where I'm trying to head here is, you mentioned St. Benedict. He's the father of Western monasticism. He wrote the Rule of Benedict, which governs or gives helpful suggestions for community life. And I feel that in our culture, we have just forgotten how to do community on some level. It's become attenuated because of any number of factors, from too much screen time to too little social trust and so forth. And I do feel there are some movements that are trying to reweave community in a really concrete way, like Shane Claiborne and the New Monastics and so forth. What does monastic life particularly, especially if someone's not going to end up becoming a vowed member of a community as you have, but what gifts does monastic life offer for this need of our time to reweave community?
Well, one of the gifts I think it offers is the upholding of the interior life, that we have an interior life, and that connects really with Thomas's story of the universe, that as the universe unfolds in its long sequence of transformations, the dimensionality of the universe itself has a physical, material dimension, as well as a spiritual or psychic or interior dimension. Mm-hmm. And that can be overlooked in our time. Maybe some people are not even aware that there is an interior life, there is an inner, or that subjectivity that he talks about in the three principles, like that the deepening of qualities that make us, that the monastic tradition has this upholding and the explication of the deepening of those interior dimensions of ourselves that can drive us into a new form. For example, the deepening of love, the deepening of gratitude, of our humility, all these qualities that are inner dimensions of the spirit, of the soul, that when worked with together inside of our humanity, it really will change the course of how we go forward, because it is the interior or the consciousness that shapes the material. It's the consciousness that shapes our education, our politics, our religion. It's the consciousness that gives us design, right? We're being shaped by our awarenesses, or the deeper dimensions of a consciousness of separation or one of communion,
Yeah. What's so interesting there, though, is so little of that, it seems to me, is on the table for public discussion. We can talk about economic indicators and even the indicators of social health and so forth, but these larger questions of spirituality and the evolution of our consciousness, they just don't seem to get as much airtime, maybe partly because, as you said earlier, they depend so much on cultivating the interiority, and that our interiority speaks with a still soft voice. It doesn't tend to hog a lot of airtime on the news or social media. So I feel like we desperately need it, and yet we don't know how to get there in our public life.
Yes, I think about this often because I think about the way forward into the Ecozoic isn't really anything that can be mandated. Like, you must love the earth by order of the military or something.
Or an executive order from the president.
Or exactly, or a fine even. You will be fined if, you don't do this or that. It seems to me that like the way forward into a new humanity, like a bubbling up of a turning around into what's possible. And the possibility is something that we haven't been together yet as a new humanity, which is exciting. But the possibility is right on the edge there of being guided from the deep connectivity of the interior, of the explication of that part of the universe unfolding that now is taking place in the beings of ourselves. Because when you look at the universe over its long transformational sequence of events, the universe always moves towards greater wholeness. There's a certain element of sacrifice, right, throughout the history, and something about humility and generosity and service to the whole. It works that way. Mm-hmm. And these are qualities that I think when Charles Eisenstein speaks of a more beautiful world, our hearts know are possible. That's really from inside of ourselves. And we hold that possibility out for each other, too.
I think what I hear you saying, Sister Gail, at least I hope what I hear you saying, is that the universe, if I were to put it bluntly, the universe knows what it's doing. And we're part of that universe that knows what it's doing. And so these are not things we have to invent whole cloth from our own ingenuity as much as we have to tune in and maybe turn down the noise that distracts us from these blueprints that are as deep as our DNA or even deeper. Am I hearing you rightly there?
Yeah. One of the things that Thomas Berry said is that when our cultural coding no longer has the capacity to guide us because it's not functioning well, we need to return to our genetic coding or our universe coding. And he called that inscendence.
Yes.
That return to a guidance that is deeper than our cultural guidance. And interestingly enough, he said the way to get there is by means of story and shared dream experience. So he's calling on a guidance, a guidance that really runs deep in ourselves. When he talks about the genetic coding or the universe coding, and he's talking about accessing that coding in different ways or ways maybe we're not used to. It's more the intuitive, the dream, the story, through the arts.
And I can imagine that those things don't play as easily in pragmatic American culture as they might play elsewhere. It's hard to put those kinds of plans for change on a chart or a graph or a strategic plan.
Yes, it is. It's a different way of accessing. I think all ways are necessary, but this is maybe a way that has not been accessed as much as it could be. And yes, and what he says is that we need a return in relationship to inscendence or the accessing of our deeper universe coding. He said we need a return to the shamanic dimension of our personalities, which I think is really fascinating. So he's talking about the capacity we all have to touch into the deeper knowing, that knowing that comes out of the long history of universe unfolding. And, the very makeup of our bodies is star material. In other words, we are genetically related to the whole story of the universe, and we carry its wisdom. And you mentioned the DNA, we carry the wisdom of the total universe in our very natures, in our very being. And he's promoting through the shamanic dimension of of our personalities is the deeper knowing through other means, inclusive of the intellect.
But not limited to it.
But not limited, yeah. And opening up to other ways of being. And that's why Thomas Berry said we need the fourfold wisdom. And here at Green Mountain Monastery, we draw upon the fourfold wisdom to guide us, which is the wisdom of religion, the wisdom of the indigenous, the wisdom of women, and the wisdom of science.
Mm-hmm.
And that fourfold context, or that fourfold map, is a way that is part of the ascendance. It's part of a return to a deeper knowing, a deeper wisdom that can help guide us forward.
Yeah.
Through the integration. Yeah.
We could do far worse than to listen to the wisdom of those four guides. Speaking of guides, as we come to a close here, I'd like to keep us steered toward the practical and the pragmatic, because of course we're in America and we do these kinds of things. But Thomas Berry had a profound experience that he describes in The Great Work, a book of his, of a meadow in his childhood. And I'm going to read a quote from The Great Work, actually, about this meadow, because it ended up being so fundamental to him. Whatever preserves and enhances this meadow in the natural cycles of its transformation is good. What is opposed to this meadow or negates it is not good. My life orientation is that simple. It is also that pervasive. It applies in economics and political orientation, as well as in education and religion and whatever. I remember reading that for the first time and immediately saying, yes, it was clear what a compass that was for him and what a compass a similar kind of revelation could be for the rest of us. And I know that you all have a meadow at Green Mountain Monastery, and I'm wondering what the parallels are between your meadow and his meadow, and what guidance meadows and similar kinds of landscapes might give us as we think about how to walk practically into this uncertain future of ours.
Yeah, well, Thomas Berry is actually buried in our meadow, and we felt that because he dedicated his life to the meadow, which was an archetype for the Earth community, that in the end the meadow took him back to itself, and it's the most appropriate place for him to be. And the meadow reminds us, in that story you just read of Thomas Berry as a young boy coming into the meadow, I like to think that Thomas had, when he arrived, so he crossed the creek and he went up a hill and he came into this meadow as he was exploring as a young boy. And I like to think that he had a geophany.
I've never heard that word.
I don't know. I think I made it up.
I like it. We will try and make that word famous.
But I was thinking that he had a geophany. So I like to imagine that, he fell to his knees and he touched the earth. And to him, the divine was revealed in the earth itself. So he had that direct experience of the mystery when he came into that meadow. And it was an experience of an awakening through and with the earth, a geophany. And so how can the meadow experience touch each of us? And I think meadows are places where we can encounter the mystery of the divine through the experience, through direct experience with the meadow and the beings of the meadow. But we need to be able to spend time there, spend time in those places with other kind and let other kind speak to us and touch us in ways that we may have not had an experience as such before.
Mm-hmm. But I completely agree with you. And yet I think there's also more to it than even that, as if that weren't enough, the kind of existential or experiential grounding for our lives. But when Thomas Berry talks about the meadow, it wasn't just a source of inspiration for him, it was also a measuring rod. He could look at the meadow and ask and answer questions about ecology and economy. What's helping that meadow literally become more healthy or not? What development is encroaching on that meadow, and what does that say about our economy? So it was actually not just an interior experience. It seems to me it was a way that he could gauge. It was his set of gauges and measuring rods for how our culture and our economy are doing.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So the meadow experience explicated itself in his adult life by being that measuring rod. So he would look at the meadow and then he would look at our our jurisprudence and say that a good jurisprudence would be one that has laws and legal ways of protecting the meadow. And a good economics would be an economics in which we extract from the meadow and then put back in a balance. And then a good education would be one in which we learn from the systems of the meadow how to design our own systems.
Right.
Because the meadow systems are functional, right? And a good religion would be a religion that can celebrate and knows how to celebrate the meadow, and ritual within the meadow experience, inclusive of the community of life. So yeah, he did use that meadow as his map.
Yeah. Sister Gail, at the conclusion of this great conversation, I find myself feeling very hopeful, and yet I know that hope is an unfashionable virtue these days. And I'm wondering, where are you drawing hope from these days, whether that's from the cosmic scale of evolutionary history or the flowers blooming in the garden and anywhere in between? Where do you find hope, and where might you share that with others who might be hunting for it?
Well, it's an interesting question, especially today of all days, because we have a butterfly nursery here in the monastery. And we bring in the monarch caterpillars that are endangered of perhaps not making it due to predators, So we have about 50 cocoons right now, and every day there are about 4 being born, 4 or 5. And just today, I happened to be there when one was born, like a butterfly hatched right at that moment of coming out of its black cocoon. And
that's a good day when you can see a butterfly emerge. Yeah. That's a good day.
And I was able to film it, and it was the most incredible and beautiful moment. And then able to, after a while, it takes time for its wings to dry, but I was able to take it out on my hands and bring it outside and watch its first flight. And just that whole process is a process. It's just so immediate in me. It's a process of hope. It's a process of kind of being with this egg that you can hardly see. Then it turns into a caterpillar, and then into its cocoon process. It goes black and then green, and then it breaks out. It's just amazing, sign of just an immediate sign of hope as a natural world gift. And then there's so many other signs of hope in terms of linking with others around the world who have dreams and visions. It's dreams and visions of a possible future, and so many giving of themselves to create visions of the new. And I really find hope in that as well. Our human spirit that comes out of this incredible story of the universe that has made it through its long evolution of 13.7 or 8 billion years. I have hope. That gives me hope from the macro to the micro.
Yeah, and I love what you just said about sharing stories across cultures, sharing stories across the globe, because I feel like the work that needs to be done is not just rolling up our sleeves and solving climate change or solving resource destruction and degradation. Obviously, those things need to be solved, but we've been told for a long time all of the solutions are within our grasp, technically, and what is lacking is the willpower to do them. And as I think through that, I feel like willpower is not something you can legislate. You can't make a people want to do something. You can't make a person want to do something. And so in the end, we come back to this idea of story, in the sense of that's where the wanting can originate. It feels to me that if we can, like the story you just shared about the butterflies, my reaction to that was, whatever might happen to the monarch species, whatever might happen to the human species, the fact that you had that experience and could tell that story makes me feel like things are going to be all right. Whatever all right looks like at the end of the day. It's I
Yes.
I just what I so appreciate about you and your work is that you are fueling our imaginations of what could be different, what new stories we could be telling ourselves.
Yes, I would like to just say just one more story, if it's okay.
Please.
Because this also happened recently. So we have a small, in the upstairs library, a small fireplace that was here with the house when we came. And last week, a few days ago, actually, we were hearing a sound up in the chute of the fireplace.
Mm-hmm.
And when we took a flashlight and looked up, it was a bird.
Uh-huh.
So somehow this bird got stuck in the chute, and there was a elbow in the chute, so I believe it was stuck there. And all we could hear inside the chute was flapping.
Mm-hmm.
So we opened up the doors to this fireplace and put a light on the bottom so the bird would see some light and perhaps travel down. But it spent all night there, wouldn't come down. And so the next morning, we just began a process of experimentation, which we've been doing through something we call interspecies encounter, or a communication with other kind. So we were, in a sense, just directing it to come down the chute, and then there was a small skylight to the left in which it would have had to fly out to get out. It's almost an impossible thing to fly out that window, because when birds get stuck in a house or a garage or something, they get disoriented. Mm-hmm. And you could open a big garage door and they still won't go out. But this is a small window. So anyway, so after a while, we were here just directing it, come on down, and it did. And it came out, and it jumped out of the fireplace. It sat on the tiles for a moment. We were just sitting here really still, just in some sense telepathically communicating out, move towards the light, towards that window. And within seconds, it seamlessly flew right out the space, right out the window. And it turned out to be a woodpecker called a flicker.
Oh, my.
But what seemed so appropriate, it just seemed like, could that be a metaphor? Was that bird just giving us the reflection back of our current predicament as a humanity stuck in the chute, flapping and flapping and not being able to get out, when in effect, freedom is just right there, like just 2 steps away.
You
Drop
just have
down and
to
then
move toward the
out.
light. Yeah.
Yeah, move towards the light. And later that day, I was outside in our gazebo, and I'm just thinking about this bird, like saying, "Well, how are you? Are you okay?" And within minutes of my thinking that there was a woodpecker on a nearby tree just pecking at the tree. And whether it was that bird or not, it was just some sense of the deep connectivity we have with the community of life when we open ourselves to it. As if almost, that bird was saying, yes, I'm okay, thank you, and hear my pecking. It's a leap. I mean, we don't know if that actually was the bird, but nonetheless, it's even part of the storyline of our connectivity with the possibilities with the community of life.
Yes, that is a beautiful story. I had it all in my head while you were describing it.
Oh,
thank you. Last question, Sister Gail. For our listeners who may be inspired by this conversation and want to leap up off their couch or out of their car, wherever they're hearing this podcast, and do something, what would you recommend as a first step? And I know that varies with every single person and their circumstances and so forth, but if a person could do just one thing to move humanity and they themselves closer to this more beautiful world, this future that's beckoning to us from the universe, how would you advise people to start?
Well, I would say follow your heart and go in the direction of what you love. And because we're in a differentiated universe, each of us goes in a different direction in terms of what they love. Find out what you love and then work towards preserving it or enhancing it or making it better.
Find your meadow, I guess.
Yeah, find your meadow. And that's the beauty of those principles, that we can't do everything, but somebody else somewhere is doing what we can't do. And we can do what someone else is not doing. And that makes our communion, our diversity or differentiation in communion so beautiful and powerful for the planet and for each other. And
yes, for better and worse, and I think for better far more so. We're in it together.
Yes, we're in it together.
Well, how can folks connect with you and with Green Mountain Monastery and its work?
Well, we will be launching a new website in September, and our website will be greenmountainmonastery.org, I guess, or just Green Mountain Monastery, Thomas Berry Sanctuary, and can link with us that way. Wonderful.
Well, I know you do great work there, and I feel like we've done some great work in this conversation. I know that I'm in a different place than when I started, and that's the mark of any good conversation. So for that and for all of the wonderful things you do to make this more beautiful world come about, thank you, Sister Gail.
And thank you so much, Kyle. It's really been wonderful being with you.
The Earth and Spirit podcast is a production of the Earth and Spirit Center, a nonprofit interfaith spirituality center in Louisville, Kentucky, devoted to cultivating a flourishing world through contemplative practice.